Welcome to the Republican Professor. I'm your host, Dr. Lucas J. Mather. Today is Thursday, 25 June, 2026 years after Jesus, and we're back celebrating the 250th anniversary of the United States of America, talking about executive power per se in this deep dive into basically Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution. And our friend today on the podcast is Charles C. Thach Jr., who wrote The Creation of the Presidency, 1775 to 1789, a study in constitutional history. This version made available by Liberty Fund, Liberty Fund Incorporated in Indianapolis, Indiana. So we'd like to thank Liberty Fund for making this material available. We'd like to thank Charles C. Thach Jr. for writing it. Charles C. Thach Jr., whose dates are 1894 to 1966, received his Ph.D. from Johns Hopkins University in 1922. Specializing in political theory, he taught at the University of Minnesota and Johns Hopkins. He later became professor of government at New York University, where he taught for over 30 years. We left off at page 53 in the backyard of my common sense epistemology mentor, Dr. Doug Guyvett, back on June 5th, 20 days ago. If you don't have a common sense epistemology mentor, go out and get one today. Reserve your common sense epistemology mentor for as little as $1,099.97, which is on sale. It's usually $1,999.99. So you save a little bit of money if you act now. Act now, and you can reserve your own common sense epistemology mentor for 24-hour period. And the best part about this, I've been part of the program. I've been on both sides as the mentee and the mentor. As the mentor, it sucks because you get woken up in the middle of the night by people who want to know, if 2 plus 2 is 4. And you got to walk them through that at 2 a.m. because they've reserved you, but as the mentee, though, let's talk about what you get as the mentee. Um, you're eating your marijuana brownies, around 3:30 a.m. and someone makes a point like, yeah, but can we even trust it, man? Can we even trust the media, man? And then, well, you bust out your phone and you call your common sense epistemology mentor and you have a conversation. You wake his ass up, you get his ass out of bed, and you have a conversation that absolutely changes lives. It changes lives for at least until their childhood trauma kicks in and then they go back to zero and then you got to start over. But that's it. That's why it's a good business model because the work continues. Okay, let's keep going. Now, what does this have to do with the 250th anniversary of the United States of America? Well, we're talking about executive power per se and how that gets recognized in the U.S. Constitution. I know all you government buffs are going to say the U.S. Constitution was written in 1787, wasn't even approved until after 1787. What has this got to do with 1776? Well, it's the story. It's all a part of the story, man. Look at the dates here. 1775 to 789. It's a part of the story of the United States of America. When we're talking about the birthday of the United States of America, dude, there was a lot of pain that came out of trying to figure out that we needed a constitution. And that's what we're celebrating. Constitution Day is a bigger deal than July 4th. Do we celebrate September 17th to the same extent that we do July 4th? No, we don't. But I mean, it's kind of like a bar mitzvah. You celebrate the birth of a child, but do you celebrate the conception to the same extent? Do you go around saying that this is my conception day? You know, 1776 is the conception. 1787 to 1789, the Constitution. That's the birthday. Yeah? Yeah. Well, anyway, listen to me bloviate. We're in national executive power, which is just chapter 3. Continuing on, we were talking about what George Washington was saying about the importance of a unified executive in fighting war, which is what they were doing. 1776, bam, they're in war. They're in war. Not only the creation of the general officers of supply, but of the civil office of Board of War were the results of his recommendations from last time, June 5th episode. And the great reorganization of 1781 had been strongly recommended by him, that is, George Washington. We're going to do a fair use of this and make a transformative reading. Go out and get your copy today. The Creation of the Presidency, 1775 to 1789, A Study in Constitutional History by Charles C. Thach, Jr. Writing to a friend in Congress, he argued as follows, George Washington. Here's a block quote. There are two things, as I have often declared, which, in my opinion, are indispensably necessary to the well-being and good government of our public affairs. These are greater powers to Congress and more responsibility and permanency in the executive bodies. If Congress suppose the boards composed of their body and always fluctuating are competent to the great business of war, which requires not only close application, but constant and uniform train of thinking and acting, they will most assuredly deceive themselves. Okay. That's an unquote. Robert Morris came early to the same opinion. If Congress mean to succeed in this contest, they must pay good executive men to do their business as it ought to be done, and not lavish millions away by their own mismanagement. They must pay good executive men to do their business as it ought to be done, and not lavish millions away by their own mismanagement. I do aver that there will always, I do aver that there will be more money lost, totally lost, in horses, wagons, cattle, for want of sufficient numbers of proper persons to look after them, than would have paid all the salaries Paine ever did or ever will grumble at. It's a quote from Robert Morris, end quote. Hamilton, at about the same period, analyzed the matter in masterfully fashion. Page 54 at the top. This is a block quote. Quote, another defect in our system, remember, this is before the Constitution, between the Declaration and the Constitution. Another defect in our system, Hamilton says, is want of method and energy in the administration. Want of method and energy in the administration. This had partly resulted from the other defect, the weakness of Congress, but in a great degree from prejudice and the want of a proper executive. Congress have kept the power too much in their own hands and have meddled too much with details of every sort. Congress is properly a deliberative corp, and it forgets itself when it attempts to play the executive. It is impossible such a body, numerous as it is and constantly fluctuating, can ever act with sufficient decision or with system. Unquote. That's from Hamilton. Continuing, Thach says, he compares the relative merits of boards and departments with single heads to great advantage of the latter. Here's a block quote. Quote, it would give us a chance of more knowledge, more activity, more responsibility, and of course, more zeal and attention. Boards partake of a part of the inconvenience of larger assemblies. Their decisions are slower, their energy less, their responsibility more diffused. They will not have the same abilities and knowledge as an administration by single men. The members of boards will take less pains to inform themselves and arrive to eminence because they have fewer motives to do it. Very interesting. Let me interject on this quote from Hamilton. Unitary executive versus a board, a committee, which is like a legislature, right? Executive should be unitary. Boards should not be doing executive stuff. The system is wrong. The structure's wrong because of human nature. There's less energy, they're slower, they take less responsibility. Responsibility gets diffused, which means that there's fewer motives to do it correctly. Okay, let's keep going. This is all in the Federalist Papers, by the way. Now, continuing quote from Hamilton, all these reasons conspire to give a preference to the plan of vesting the great executive departments of the state in the hands of individuals. As these men will be, of course, at all times under the direction of Congress, we shall blend the advantage uh, we shall blend the advantages of a monarchy and republic in our Constitution, unquote. Thach continues, nor would this result in reducing the prestige of Congress. Here's another quote, right? See this. These quotes and unquotes are a little bit, the format I would have, Liberty, please don't be offended, but I would have changed the format a little bit. Uh, they would have hap- they would have precisely the same rights and powers as heretofore, happily disencumbered of the detail. This is Hamilton apparently still to James Duane. Well, thank you for having the date in there. Finally, geez, I get a good footnote. September 3rd, 1780. They would this is a quote from Hamilton. They quote, they would have precisely the same rights and powers as heretofore, happily disencumbered of the detail. They would have to inspect the conduct of their ministers, deliberate upon their plans, originate others for the public good, only observing this rule that they ought to consult their ministers and get all the information and advice they could get from them before they entered into new measures or made changes in the old, unquote. Thach continues. Experience was undoubtedly on the side of the executives. The example of Washington was a host in itself, energy, probity, disinterestedness, and a magnificent tactfulness in avoiding even the semblance of advancing his personal interests are written large on almost every one of his official acts. His patient devotion to the cause of independence was time and time again the sole support on which it rested. Fear of the man on horseback should have seemed rather puerile in the face of practical experience. and especially after the dignified and patently sincere retirement to Mount Vernon, and even the more striking illustration of entire absence of selfish purpose afforded by the Newburgh episode. What was even more important, Washington afforded the country an example of the national leader par excellence. In the troubled days that followed peace, thoughts of how his personality had ridden the storm of separatism and failure recurred, with the inevitable conclusion that it was only through the same agency that orderly government could be restored. But Washington's was not an isolated instance of the value of the efficient and responsible executive head. The example of the first Commissary General, Joseph Trumbull, is an eloquent testimonial to the efficacy of this principle of administration, and an equally eloquent illustration of the way in which Congress managed business. Now, remember, I told you to pay attention to the Commissary General coming up. Here it is. The following report, signed by two such conspicuous anti-executives as Samuel Adams, remember the beer guy, and Richard Henry Lee, speaks for itself. Page 55 at the bottom. Now we're going to page 56 at the top. Here's a quote. It appears to your committee that the late Commissary General Joseph Trumbull, coming into office in the earliest stage of the American contest, found himself without a system by which to trace the plan of his duty, that with great care, industry, labor, and attention, he instituted a plan by which the Army, during his continuance in office, was amply supplied with much economy and to general satisfaction, that during his commissariat he was obliged to act not only in capacity of Commissary General of purchases, but to direct all the issues of provisions, and for near two campaigns had the additional duty of purveyor of the hospitals and quartermaster general. Let me just interject in the middle of this quote here. He was a badass executive. This example is showing the early Americans that a unitary executive has incredible virtues. Yes, you might be traumatized by monarchy and you might say, no, we can't have one man in charge. But when one man is in charge and has a motivation to do well because he will be blamed, it'll be clear whose fault it is. It'll be his. And it'll also be clear who should be praised if it goes well. Well, then you get somebody with his kind of skills, they can shine. So they're seeing this example, and this is the background for the presidency. They're like, okay, maybe we need that in the chief executive, which becomes the presidency, as we find out. Okay, where did I leave off in this quote? For nearly two campaigns, he had the additional duty of purveyor of the hospitals and quartermaster general. It appears also to your committee that the said commissary general made great savings to the public by his large and seasonable purchases and contracts, outrunning and anticipating in many instances the orders of Congress, by which he kept up large supplies, thereby moderating the demands of the seller, intercepting monopolies, and keeping down prices, which are now greatly augmented. Unquote. This is from the Journals of Congress, Volume 3, page 239. And Thach says, and yet Congress, through its short-sighted policy of keeping power within its own hands. See, boards don't want to give up any power usually, but then that changes with this Chevron stuff. We'll, pay attention to that. But so Congress, through its short-sighted policy of keeping power within its own hands, drove Trumbull from office. And now we have John Marshall's account of the proceeding. Wow. John Marshall, the same one that became Chief Justice. I got to get a drink of water. Hold on a sec. Starting to get warm. One moment. Okay, I'm back. Okay. Had to heat up my coffee. All right. Now, John Marshall's quotation on page 56. Quote, the principle adopted in the new arrangement which expelled Colonel Trumbull from the service, if an error, is one which an assembly without that practical knowledge which is drawn from experience will ever be much inclined to commit. Let me interject here. John Marshall is saying the problem practically in this unwise decision to get rid of Trumbull, who was very effective as an executive, he was a badass executive, was a result of the structure here, the structure of the institution making the decision. It was an assembly, not a person with a unified center of consciousness. It was an assembly, a group of people. Now, so John Marshall's saying here, if an error driving him from the service, Colonel Trumbull, if an error is one which an assembly without that practical knowledge, in other words, assemblies are dumb. They're dumb. It's just the way it is. It's the structure of the thing. Without that practical knowledge, which is drawn from experience, and that is a unified consciousness. This is me talking. Experience, people talk about shared experience, right? That is possible, of course. But when you're talking about administration, especially in war, when you have to get things done quickly, and you have to act with energy, dispatch, secrecy, and effectiveness, assemblies is not the way to do it because of the center of experience. You have to have experience. Experience is best understood the way you experience things, which is as a unified center of consciousness, as one person. That's what we usually mean by experience. It's a philosophy of mind point with all, you know, sorry, Jagwan Kim, I didn't mean to break you. Sorry, Daniel Dennett, you know, roll your eyes. Churchland, ironic name for him. Paul. Um, and all the other monkeys that are against unified experience in philosophy of mind. It's a philosophy of mind point, correctly understood. It was a creation, John Marshall continues in this quote, of some of the subordinate officers of an independence on the head of that department and an intermediate and direct dependence on Congress. In addition to the Commissary General of Purchases and Commissary General of Issues, each to be appointed by Congress, the new plan contemplated 4 deputies in each department who were also to be appointed by the same body and were not removable by the head of the department. What could possibly go wrong? But might be suspended and accused before Congress, who should then examine the charge and either remove the accused individual from office or restore him to it. This is so damaging. Continuing the quote, page 57 at the top. This imperium in imperio, erected in direct opposition to the opinion of the commander in chief, effectually drove Colonel Trumbull from the army. The structure was so screwed up, this badass executive who was getting crap done, which is helping us win the war, was driven from the army. In his letter to Congress, dated the 19th of July, 1777, stating his reasons for declining the commission of Commissary General of Purchases, which was offered to him. He says, and this is a quote of Trumbull within the quote of John Marshall, "In my humble opinion, the head of everyday department ought to have control of it. In this establishment, an imperium in imperio is created. If I consent to act, I must be at continual variance with the whole department, and of course be in continual hot water. I must in turn I must turn accuser and be continually applying to Congress and attending with witnesses to support my charges, or I must sit down in ease and quiet, let the deputies do as they like, and enjoy a sinecure. I can by no means consent to act under a regulation which, in my opinion, will never answer the purpose intended by Congress, nor supply the Army as it should be." That's the end of the quote within the quote, and it's also the end of John Marshall's quote. Back to Thach. The results of this were not slow in coming. Quote, "In every military division of the continent, loud complaints were made of the deficiency of supplies," unquote. And it is interesting to observe that in less than a year, Congress found it necessary to recede from its position in order to obtain a competent man. Included in its reorganization ordinance was the provision that, quote, "the Commissary General of Purchases have full power to appoint and remove every officer in his department," unquote. Well, that's a move in the right direction. Responsibility and control go together. Another philosophy of point. That's a philosophy of human agency point. Metaphysics of human agency. How do you hold somebody responsible if they don't have control? But people who are traumatized by executives or legislative power, whatever, they're in their trauma. They can't understand that control is a good thing. It's tied to morality. How do you have responsibility, for example, for your children if you can't control them? Hello? It's the same thing in business. How do you have a responsibility for your business if you can't control it? There are certain things that need to be under your control. And there's some people that just don't get it. It's also true in church administration, FYI. I'm going to take a drink of water. Hot, hot water with caffeine in it. Now, here we go. Control is not a bad thing, not any more than responsibility is a bad thing. They go together. Um, it is equally interesting to note that this same Wadsworth, who then dictated his own terms to Congress as representative from Connecticut in the first Congress, came forward as the chief defender of the principle of the unit head of the Treasury Department and of the financial administration of Robert Morris. The lessons of revolutionary experience, written in terms of human suffering, were not soon forgotten. Wow. Wow, 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 wow. Suffering. They had to go through suffering to learn these lessons. The later ordinances of Congress respecting the departments, page 57 at the bottom, indicate, page 57 at the top, 58 at the top, an increasing adherence to the principles of good administrative organization. Thus, when the War Department was reorganized in 1782, a notable degree of integration was secured by a provision that the clothier general should quote, receive his instructions from the War Office and that the distributions of clothing for the Army be made under the Secretary of War's directions, unquote, and that, quote, the Commissary General of Prisoners, as far as respects the securing of military prisoners and making returns of them, take his directions from the Secretary of War, unquote, and that, quote, all military and other officers attending upon or connected with the Army of the United States be, and United States is capitalized. Yeah. And B, and they are hereby required and enjoined to observe the directions of the Secretary of War in making and transmitting proper returns and such other matters as may tend to facilitate the business of his department, unquote. That's illustrative of one executive, the Secretary of War, having control, being able to fire people, appoint people, get them out of there, get them in there, etc. In in that of January 27th, 1785, it was expressly provided that the secretary, not a board, not a committee, the secretary, a unified person, unified center of consciousness, should, quote, appoint and remove at pleasure all persons employed under him and should be responsible for their conduct in office, unquote. So this is only 2.5 years before the Constitution was being written. They're slow to learn. I mean, it's taken 9 years. This is 1785. So from 1776 to 1785, that's 9 years of slogging through war, getting their asses kicked by the British, almost losing, but not losing. Well, because they're learning. And that's good. They're learning. They're learning. Thach continues. Also, when the business of Indian affairs was finally regulated in 1787, the superintendents were required to correspond with Congress only through the Secretary of War, and to, quote, obey all instructions which they shall from time to time receive from the said Secretary of War, unquote. Similarly, in the act creating the office of Superintendent of Finance, that officer was empowered, quote, to direct and control all persons employed in procuring supplies for the public service and in the expenditure of public money, unquote. Nor did the insistence on the principle of personal separation of powers, Thach continues on the bottom, page 58, which had finally put the departments under non-congressional hands, break all organic connection between Congress and the departments and the departments. Congress, of course, remained in the relation of supreme head to all other national agencies and continued to be the source of administrative power. Okay, so that hasn't been fixed yet. It will be fixed in the Constitution. It's still determined, that is, Congress still determined the number and functions of all officers and was free to issue specific orders when it saw fit, that is, executive orders being issued by a legislative body. You see how the separation of powers hasn't occurred yet. Congress was free to issue specific executive orders when it saw fit, while always exercising the general right of control. So you still have legislative supremacy here, which is a problem. It's the vortex that Madison was talking about in Federalist 47 to 51, if you want to take a look at that in Federalist Papers. Page 59 at the top. But the original committee origin of the departments left its impress on them when they ceased to be a part of Congress. The Secretary of Foreign Affairs was required to report, quote, report on all cases expressly referred to him for that purpose by Congress, and on all others touching his department in which he may conceive it necessary, unquote, being also empowered to attend all sessions of Congress and to, quote, give information to Congress respecting his department, explain and answer objections to his reports when under consideration, if required by a member, and no objection be made by Congress, unquote. and to, quote, answer such inquiries respecting his department as may be put from the chair by order of Congress, and to questions stated in writing about matters of fact which lie within his knowledge when put by the president at the request of a member and not disapproved of by Congress, unquote. That word president is not clear what that means to me right now. I'm not sure what he means. It must be some part of Congress, some function of Congress by the president, somebody presiding over a session, maybe. Okay, it's probably a parliamentary term, I think. The Secretary of War was, quote, to give his opinion on all such subjects as shall be referred to him by Congress, and if at any time he shall think a measure necessary to which his powers are incompetent, he shall communicate the same to Congress for their direction therein, unquote. The superintendent of finance was, quote, to digest and report plans for improving and regulating the finances and for establishing order and economy in the expenditure of the public money, unquote. Thach continues, as a matter of fact, after the cessation of hostilities had relieved the national government of the most of its administrative business, the administrative organs themselves seem to have been regarded as satisfactorily organized. Knox wrote, when accepting the Secretaryship of War, quote, Congress have rendered the powers and duties of the office respectable. To the same effect, that was the done, we're done with the quote. Thach continues, to the same effect, Otto, the French representative in America, declared in 1787, page 60 at the top, quote, the various departments have been arranged in the most perfect manner. A regular system has been introduced into all the branches of the general administration, and but for the want of permanent revenue, the United States would be one of the best organized governments, unquote. All right. So in other words, they're learning. They're learning, and it's even catching the eyes of some foreign dignitaries. Gonna get a drink of coffee. Hold on a sec. Okay. Now, Thach continues. There was, however, no constitutional possibility of erecting a legal barrier which Congress could not at pleasure cross. See? So that Thach is pointing out, yes, they're learning, but they haven't fixed the problem here in terms of structure yet. Because the structure of legislative vortex, legislative supremacy, is what keeps the problem from fully being solved as much as it can be, given human nature. This structure creates possibilities for malfeasance into the future, and it must be solved. Okay. Thach continues, as a consequence, there was no method by which Congress could be prevented from continuing to busy itself with details, meddling, to take up departmental matters that came before it from any source, even bad sources, and to assign their consideration to special committees without consultation with the department head. In foreign affairs, this irregular method of procedure was the subject of a vigorous and successful complaint by Jay, with the result that Congress required all correspondence to and from Congress on the subject of foreign relations to pass through the Secretary's hands. See, they're learning. We need some unitary executive here. We need a center of consciousness. But Congress refused to stay within the bounds of what properly was its business. And until the end, that is when the Constitution was ratified, until the end, continued to act as an administrative body, that's an executive body, even though it's legislative, as almost any page of its recorded proceedings will demonstrate. Where's my water? Yeah, well, we're almost done. My coffee's still warm, so I'm really enjoying this. I'm enjoying it because it's summer, it's 25 June 2026. We're in summer now in SoCal, and I've got a jacket on. I've got a black jacket and a tie on, and it's getting warm. I do not have the air conditioning on, trying to save money here. You know what I mean? In California. Did you guys happen to see that we got a great Supreme Court decision today on the Second Amendment? And the guy that argued the case, Alan Beck, came on the podcast 2 years ago. Alan Beck, Hawaii Second Amendment Civil Rights, Civil Liberties attorney. Check him out. Check that episode out. I'm going to link it on this episode when we publish here in a bit. Okay, now, Thach continues, it will have been noticed that practically all the progress made prior to 1787 was in the direction of a personal separation of functions or of internal administrative organization. The question of an independent executive department could hardly be raised under the existing frame of government. Wow. Wow. Let me read that again. The question of an independent executive department could hardly be raised under the existing frame of government. Nothing, in fact, was suggested along these lines except Jefferson's proposed Committee of States. Yeah, that's still a committee, okay? Accordingly, governmental experience, except for this, failed to suggest a solution of the complex question of a distribution of functions into the two classes, legislative and executive. Page 61 at the top. Okay, we're going to stop there today, and we're going to continue with Jefferson's idea. The next sentence that we're going to get to is this experiment of Jefferson's is of interest first because of its failure. Jefferson's idea failed. It was a final blow, if one were needed, to executive plurality. We're going to get to that part of the story next time, celebrating in this series the 250th anniversary of the United States of America. God bless you guys. I've enjoyed this time with you, and we'll continue from there in the swirly, twirly gumdrops of the creation of the presidency, 1775 to 1789, is studied in constitutional history by Charles C. Thach Jr., made available by Liberty Fund Press. Go out and get your copy today. Get a physical copy, something that you can hold in your hands and impress your friends with. And if you don't impress your friends with this copy, maybe they're not really your friends. God bless you guys. It's 25 June 2026, years after Jesus. It's a Thursday. Take care.